He held the letter up in the middle of that saloon, high enough that everybody drinking at the bar could see it. $1 million, he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. That's what I'll pay you. Right now. All you gotta do is read it out loud. Every head in that saloon turned. Because standing in front of him was a woman in a plain gray morning dress, a widow's shawl still around her shoulders even though her husband had been gone the better part of a year, and everybody in that room, every card player, every drinker, every soul leaning against that bar, figured they already knew exactly how this was about to go. They figured a rich man was fixing to embarrass a poor widow in front of half the town, just to get a laugh out of his friends. They were wrong. Every last one of them. And by the time this story's done, I think you're going to understand exactly why that saloon went so quiet it froze solid, and why the people who were there that day still bring it up, all these years later. Whenever somebody in town needs reminding what real dignity looks like, if you're the kind of person who's ever been counted out by somebody who didn't know the first thing about you, stay with me. And if you want more stories just like this one, go on and hit that subscribe button right now, because we bring you a new one every single week. And I don't want you to miss what's coming next. All right, let's go back to where this really started. Her name was Margaret Doyle, though most folks in town just called her Widow Doyle, the way small towns do when a woman's loss becomes the only thing people remember to call her by. She was 34 years old, not old by most measures, but old enough to have already buried a husband, and old enough to know that grief doesn't ask your permission before it moves into your house and stays. Her husband, Thomas, had been a schoolteacher, a gentle, quiet man who read to her every evening from whatever book he was working through, who believed, the same as her own father before him, that a sharp mind was worth more to a person than a full purse. He'd died of a lung fever the winter before last, sudden enough that Margaret hadn't even had the chance to say a proper goodbye, only long enough to hold his hand while it went cold in hers. And here's the part of Margaret's story a lot of you watching are going to feel in your own chest, because I know plenty of you have lived it. Her mother, Ruth, had been widowed too, years before, when Margaret was just a girl of 9. Margaret grew up watching her own mother do exactly what Margaret was doing now. Watched her mother go quiet at church socials when the other women whispered behind their fans. Watched her mother count pennies at the mercantile counter while pretending she wasn't. Watched her mother hold her head up anyway, every single day, because there wasn't another choice available to a woman raising a child alone on the edge of the frontier. Grief doesn't excuse you from living, Ruth used to tell her, back when Margaret was young enough to still be angry at the world for taking her father. It just makes the living a little heavier for a while. You carry it anyway. That's all any of us ever do. Margaret remembered, clear as anything, the winter her mother had taken in washing for 3 families just to keep them fed. Hands cracked raw from the cold water, never once complaining where Margaret could hear it. She remembered the Christmas when there'd been no money for anything beyond bread and a little sugar, and her mother had sat her down anyway and told her stories by candlelight until the lack of presents under the tree stopped mattering so much. Ruth never remarried. Folks in town used to whisper about that too. A woman alone. Raising a daughter alone, by choice as much as circumstance, because Ruth had told Margaret once, plain as anything, that she'd rather be alone and respected than remarried and small. Margaret hadn't understood those words the way she understood them now, sitting in a house too quiet, without Thomas's voice reading to her in the evenings, raising the question every widow eventually has to answer for herself. What happens to me now? She'd taken in mending and letter writing for folks in town who couldn't read or write well themselves, a skill Thomas had made certain she had, same as her own mother had made certain of it for her. It wasn't much. It kept the roof over her head and food enough on the table. But it wasn't a life anybody would call comfortable, and everyone in town knew it, including the man who was about to make that fact the center of an entertainment for his friends. His name was Harrison Cole, and he was, by most every measure this territory used to judge a man, an enormous success. He'd come out west with almost nothing at 20 years old and built, over the next 2 decades, the largest cattle operation for 50 miles in any direction. By the time he was 41, folks wrote about him in the territorial papers. Fathers pointed him out to their sons as proof of what a man could build with grit and nerve alone. But there was something underneath all that success, something that only ever showed up in particular moments, when there was an audience watching. When there was somebody quieter, somebody with less than him, sitting close enough to reach. Harrison wasn't a cruel man by his own accounting. He'd have told you himself, and meant it, that he never did a hard thing to anybody who didn't have it coming. But there's a particular kind of blindness that comes with never once losing. A man forgets after enough winning that the world doesn't actually run on the same rules for everybody standing in it. He'd noticed Margaret Doyle around town plenty of times, the widow who wrote letters for folks. Quiet. Kept to herself. Wore that same gray dress to church every Sunday like it was the only one she owned, which, though Harrison never once considered it, it likely was. Today, drinking with 3 of his ranch hands and his business partner in the middle of the afternoon, feeling flush off a cattle sale that had gone better than expected, Harrison Cole spotted Margaret walking past the saloon doors with a letter in her hand, on her way to deliver it for whoever had paid her the few cents to write it. And something about the sight of her, steady, composed, carrying herself with more dignity than a woman in her circumstances had any business carrying, in Harrison's estimation, struck him as an opportunity for a little afternoon entertainment. Some of you watching right now already know exactly the kind of man I'm describing. Maybe you've worked for one. Maybe you've been married to one. Maybe you raised one, and you're still trying to figure out where you went wrong. Whoever he reminds you of, hang on to that thought. We're going to come back to it. Mrs. Doyle. Harrison's voice carried clean across the saloon floor, easy and warm in the way a man's voice gets when he already knows every eye in the room is about to turn toward him. Come in here a moment. I've got a proposition for you. Margaret stopped in the doorway. The afternoon sun was behind her, and for a moment she was just a silhouette in the frame, a woman deciding whether whatever waited inside was worth the trouble of finding out. She'd learned over the last year when a man's tone meant kindness and when it meant something else wearing kindness's coat. This one, she already suspected, was the second kind. But refusing a man like Harrison Cole outright, in the middle of a saloon full of his friends, wasn't a luxury a widow living on mending money could always afford. So she stepped inside. "Mr. Cole," she said, plain and even. "You've got a letter there." He nodded toward the paper in her hand. "Somebody's business, I imagine, that you're carrying across town for a few pennies." "That's right. Tell me something." He leaned back in his chair, and the ranch hands beside him were already grinning, sensing the shape of something coming even before Harrison said it outright. "Can you actually read that letter? Or do you just carry them around and pretend, and let the folks who hired you assume you know what's written on the page?" The saloon went a little quiet at that. One of the card players at a corner table set his hand down, listening now instead of playing. "I can read it," Margaret said. "No sharpness in it. Just plain fact, same as she'd say the sky was blue." "Is that so?" Harrison's grin widened, and he reached into his coat. What he pulled out wasn't Margaret's letter. It was his own, a folded piece of paper, sealed with wax, that he set down flat on the bar top between them. "Here's my proposition," he said. $1 million, Mrs. Doyle. Right here, written and signed, drawn against my own accounts. Yours, free and clear, if you can read this letter out loud, front to back, without a single mistake." A ripple went through the saloon. Somebody at the bar let out a low whistle. The bartender, polishing a glass, stopped polishing it. "You're mocking me, Mr. Cole," Margaret said quietly. "I'm doing no such thing." He spread his hands, all innocence, though the grin hadn't left his face. "I'm offering a poor widow the chance at more money than she'll see in 10 lifetimes of mending shirts. All she has to do is prove she can read. Seems a fair trade to me. Now here's what I want you to think about for a second, because I think it matters." Harrison Cole believed, standing there in that saloon, that there wasn't a single version of this moment where he didn't come out on top. If Margaret couldn't read it, if she stumbled, if her voice shook, he'd get his laugh, and the whole town would remember the day Widow Doyle got caught in her own pretending. And if she refused, that told the same story wearing a different coat. He never once considered there might be a third way this could go. If you've ever been tested like this, put on the spot in front of people just so somebody else could get a laugh at your expense, go ahead and drop a comment right now and tell me about it. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not alone in this room. Margaret looked at that letter sitting on the bar top, and for a long moment, she didn't reach for it. She thought about her mother, Ruth, all those years ago, counting pennies at the mercantile counter while the other women whispered behind their fans. She thought about the particular kind of strength it takes to hold your head up in a room that's already decided what you are before you've said a single word. And she thought about Thomas, gentle, quiet Thomas, reading to her every evening in a voice she'd have given anything to hear. One more time, teaching her that words on a page were never something to be afraid of, no matter who was trying to use them against you. Grief doesn't excuse you from living, her mother's voice said. Somewhere in the back of her mind, you carry it anyway. That's all any of us ever do. There was a version of this moment where Margaret set the letter back down, gathered what dignity she had left, and walked straight back out through those saloon doors without another word. It would have been easier. Safer, certainly. But 3 years of swallowing small cruelties, a year of widowhood on top of it, a lifetime of watching her own mother swallow the exact same thing, had worn a particular kind of patience thin in her, and something in her decided, quiet and sure, that today wasn't going to be another one of those days. Margaret reached out and picked up the letter. Her hand didn't shake, not once. "You're certain," she said, looking Harrison Cole dead in the eye, "that you want me to?" "Entirely," he said, and there was real delight in it now, the easy confidence of a man watching a game unfold exactly the way he'd already decided it would. And that, my friends, is where this story really begins. The saloon had gone quiet enough that you could hear the clock above the bar ticking, quiet enough to hear a chair leg scrape somewhere behind her, as one of the card players turned fully around in his seat to watch. Margaret broke the wax seal, unfolded the letter, and did not rush a single word of what came next. "To whom it may concern," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying easy across that quiet room. "Let it be known that the undersigned, Harrison Cole, does hereby—" She stopped, not because she'd lost her place, because something in the wording had caught her attention the way a snagged thread catches a seamstress's eye before anybody else in the room would ever notice it was there. One of the ranch hands laughed, nervous, misreading the pause. "Go on then. Can't read past the first line?" "I can read every line," Margaret said, calm as still water. "I'm simply making certain I read it correctly, Mr. Cole, since you were so particular about accuracy being the whole point of this exercise." That drew a low chuckle from somewhere at the bar, quickly swallowed when Harrison's smile flickered, just barely, at the edges. "Go on then," he said, Margaret continued, reading through the body of the letter. A business matter, it turned out. A bill of sale for a parcel of land Harrison intended to purchase from a neighboring rancher, laying out the terms, the acreage, the price agreed upon. She read every word of it clean and clear. And then she reached the final paragraph, and stopped again. "There's an error here," she said. "If you're enjoying this story so far, this is exactly the moment worth sticking around for, because what Margaret found in that letter is the reason this whole town still talks about that afternoon. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. And let's get right back into it." The saloon had gone dead silent. Even the bartender had stopped moving. "An error," Harrison repeated, and there was an edge creeping into his voice now that hadn't been there a minute ago. "The acreage stated here," Margaret said, tapping the page gently, "says 420 acres, but the price agreed upon, further down, is calculated at the rate you'd negotiated for 320. Someone's transposed the numbers, Mr. Cole. Whether it was you or whoever drafted this on your behalf, I couldn't say. But as written, you're agreeing to pay for 100 fewer acres than you're set to receive. Signed as it stands, this letter would cost the seller 100 acres of land he never agreed to give away." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely than the one before it. One of the ranch hands let out a low, startled laugh before he could stop himself. The card player who'd turned around in his chair was grinning outright now, elbowing the man beside him. Even the bartender, who'd seen plenty in his years running that saloon, was watching with something like genuine astonishment. Harrison snatched the letter from her hands, scanning it himself, his eyes moving fast down the page like the numbers might rearrange themselves back into what he'd expected to see. "They didn't. This is—" He stopped, jaw tight. "This is a clerical matter. My lawyer drafted this." "Then your lawyer made a mistake," Margaret said, and there was no triumph in her voice at all. If anything, there was something almost gentle in it, which somehow made the moment land a great deal harder than mockery ever could have. It happens to the best of us, Mr. Cole, even careful men. It wasn't the correction itself that froze that saloon. It was the fact that Margaret Doyle, a widow in a plain gray dress, mocked not 5 minutes earlier in front of the whole room, had just handed Harrison Cole back his own words, his own tone, gentle as anything, and made the entire room understand in one single breath exactly who'd actually been tested that afternoon, and exactly who had failed it. Now, I want to ask you something, and I really do want your honest answer down in the comments. If you'd been sitting at that bar and watched this happen, would you have laughed along with Harrison at the start? Or would you have already had your doubts about him? I think a lot of you already know exactly which one you'd have been. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street, the sound of it carrying strange and loud through the sudden quiet of the saloon. Then one of the ranch hands, a young man named Silas who couldn't have been more than 19, said what half the room was already thinking, but too careful to say out loud. "Boss, she just read your own letter better than the man who drafted it." "That's not the point of this," Harrison said, sharper than he meant to, and you could see the moment he heard himself say it, and didn't much care for the sound of it. "Wasn't it?" The voice came from a heavy-set man seated near the end of the bar, Harrison's business partner, a rancher named Everett Dunn, who'd been quiet up until now. "Way I understood it, the point was to see if the widow could read. Seems to me she's read circles around the lot of us." A woman near the doorway, the saloon owner's wife who'd come out at the sound of the commotion, let out a short laugh she didn't bother hiding. 100 acres, Harrison. That's what you nearly signed away over a game." "It didn't get signed," Harrison said. Too quick, too defensive, and the room heard exactly what that defensiveness meant. "No," Everett said slowly, setting his own glass down on the bar, unable to let the thought go entirely, the businessman in him working the numbers even now. "But it might have, if she hadn't caught it. If you'd been fool enough to sign this without checking it yourself, trusting your lawyer's word over your own eyes." He gave a low whistle. "That's not a small thing, Harrison. That's the kind of mistake that costs a man his ranch." That observation landed harder than it needed to, precisely because it was true, and precisely because it came from the one man in that room whose judgment Harrison valued above nearly anybody else's. Margaret said nothing further. She didn't need to. She stood there quiet, letter still resting on the bar between them, and waited. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, just the plain patience of a woman who understood some lessons teach themselves, if you only give them a little room to. It was the saloon owner's wife, a woman named Agnes, who finally broke the heavier silence, her voice carrying the particular authority of somebody who'd run a business long enough to have earned the right to speak plainly in it. "Mrs. Doyle." She stepped further into the room. "Where does a woman learn to catch a thing like that? That wasn't luck. You knew exactly what you were looking at the moment you saw it." Margaret hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the plain discomfort of being asked to talk about herself in front of a room that minutes ago had been ready to laugh at her. "My husband was a school teacher," she said finally, and her voice caught just slightly on the word "was." "Thomas Doyle. He believed a sharp mind mattered more than a full purse, and he made certain I had one, the same as my own mother made certain of it for me, after my father passed when I was a girl. I've read contracts and letters and bills of sale for half this town since Thomas died, because it's the only trade a widow with an education and no husband's income has much use for out here." Her chin lifted just slightly. "I've buried a husband, Mrs. Agnes. I've watched my mother bury one before him. I think between the two of us, we learned plenty about reading the fine print men hope you never look at too closely." Nobody laughed now, not one soul in that saloon. Silas, who'd laughed the loudest earlier, was looking at her with something that looked a great deal like respect. Everett had gone thoughtful, turning his glass slowly on the bar top. Agnes's eyes had gone soft in a way that suggested she knew exactly what it cost a woman to say those words out loud in front of strangers. And Harrison was looking at Margaret Doyle the way a man looks at something he's walked past 100 times, without ever once actually seeing it. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Doyle," he said finally. The words came out rough, unpracticed. The words of a man who didn't say them often, and wasn't entirely certain how. Margaret looked at him a long moment. "You don't owe me the money," she said quiet. "I wouldn't take a fortune offered as a joke, corrected or not. That was never what this afternoon was about, and I think you understand that now. Then what do I owe you?" She thought about it honestly, the way her mother had taught her to think about things. Not fast, not for show, but with real weight behind it. "The same respect," she said, "you'd have shown any other soul who walked through those doors today. That's all it ever needed to be." Harrison stood there a long moment, staring down at the torn corner of his own pride. The part of him that had walked into that saloon certain there wasn't a version of the afternoon where he didn't come out ahead. He thought briefly of his own father, a hard, unyielding man who'd built the first 100 acres of the coal ranch with nothing but stubbornness and bare hands. A man who'd never once in Harrison's memory admitted to being wrong about anything. Harrison had grown up believing that was strength, that bending even a little was the same thing as breaking. He was beginning to understand, standing there with half the town watching, that he might have learned the wrong lesson from the right man. He picked up his own letter off the bar, and right there in front of everybody, tore it clean in half. "I'll have it redrafted properly," he said. "Correctly this time, not as a wager. And I'd like to pay you for your time this afternoon, Mrs. Doyle. A fair wage, same as I'd pay any man who caught an error that would have cost me 100 acres. Margaret almost smiled. "That's not necessary." "I know it isn't," Harrison said. "I'd like to anyway." He turned to the room then, and something in the way he carried himself had shifted. The easy performing confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, something a good deal more uncertain, and strange as it sounds, a great deal more likable for it. "I expect I owe the rest of you an apology too," he said slowly. "Though I suspect it's a longer one than I've got the words for right now. I've made a habit, I think, of mistaking a person's circumstances for their worth. Figuring that because a woman was widowed, or poor, or quiet, she had less to offer a room than somebody loud enough to fill it up." He glanced at Margaret, then back around the saloon. "I don't expect that habit breaks in one afternoon. But I'd like to try." Agnes set a fresh glass down in front of Margaret, gentle, unasked. "On the house, Mrs. Doyle. I believe you've earned it." And slowly the saloon began to breathe again, the particular relief of a room that had braved something hard, together, and come out the other side of it, maybe even better for having gone through it. They tell this story a little different depending on who's doing the telling, all these years later. Some folks say Harrison Cole lost a fortune that afternoon and paid dearly for his own arrogance. Some say the widow everybody had quietly written off turned out sharper than every man in that saloon combined. The details shift a bit with each retelling, the way a good story does when it's worth passing down. But the people who were actually there, Silas, Everett, Agnes, every soul who happened to be leaning against that bar, they all remember the same thing, the part that never changes, no matter who's doing the telling. They remember that Harrison Cole, a man who'd never once in his life admitted to being wrong in front of an audience, stood right there in the middle of his own favorite saloon, and did exactly that. Not because he was forced to, not because he was shamed into it, but because a widow he'd underestimated showed him, without ever once raising her voice, without a single unkind word, that the sharpest correction a person can ever give somebody isn't cruelty. It's just the plain truth, spoken calmly, by somebody who was never asking permission to be taken seriously in the first place. Margaret Doyle kept writing letters for the folks in town for another year after that afternoon. The word had spread fast enough by then that she rarely had to ask anybody twice whether they trusted her with their business. Harrison Cole started sending his contracts to her for review before he signed a single one, quietly at first, then openly, until it became known through the whole territory that Cole Cattle Company didn't finalize a deal without Widow Doyle's eyes on the paperwork first. He paid her fair for it, every time, and never once again tried to turn her circumstances into a spectacle for anybody's entertainment. Their friendship, when it came slow and careful, the way real things do when two people have both already buried somebody they loved and know better than to rush toward anything that matters. It started with contracts left on Agnes's bar for Margaret's review, and grew into longer conversations over tea about books Thomas had once loved, about Harrison's own quiet regrets, about the particular loneliness of a life spent believing you had to be right about everything in order to be worth anything at all. Margaret brought her mother, Ruth, to town for the wedding. 2 years later, a small affair, nothing grand, just the people who mattered. Ruth stood at the back of that little church and cried the whole way through, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of watching a daughter find at last the kind of respect she'd spent a lifetime teaching her never to settle for anything less than. Agnes at the saloon used to say she knew exactly where it was headed the day she watched Harrison tear that letter in half. A man doesn't destroy his own pride in front of a room full of witnesses, she'd tell anybody who asked. Unless some stubborn part of him already knows he's about to lose something a great deal more valuable if he doesn't change. Harrison never did learn to be a man who avoided mistakes entirely. Nobody does, and this is a lesson every one of us watching could stand to remember for ourselves. But he learned, in time, to be a man who could hear himself corrected without his whole pride shattering to pieces, which, as Margaret liked to say years later, is a far rarer and more valuable thing to learn than never being wrong in the first place. And every so often, at a dinner or a gathering in that town, when somebody says something careless about a person they've decided is beneath their notice, Margaret Doyle has been known to set down whatever she's holding, look at them steady, and ask, gentle as anything, "Are you certain that's what you meant to say?" More often than not, it isn't. And more often than not, by the end of the evening, they've learned exactly what Harrison Cole learned that afternoon in the saloon, that the sharpest lesson a person can ever receive rarely arrives with raised voices or clenched fists. Sometimes it arrives quiet, in the voice of a widow the world had already decided to stop listening to. And once you've truly heard it, you never forget it again. If this story touched something in you, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this story find the people who need to hear it. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your sign, because we bring a new story just like this one every single week. I want to know, down in the comments, who does Margaret remind you of? A mother, maybe. A grandmother. Somebody in your own life who carried more than anybody ever gave them credit for. I read every single comment, and I promise you I'd love to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.